Hello and welcome to the show where I try and make a little sense out of this stunning and brave new world we all live in by talking to a series of expert witnesses and inviting them to share their truth. And today I'm delighted to be talking plenty more sense, not sensibility, with the brilliant Natty, who amongst other things is a passionate champion of men's human rights, a regular contributor to Honey Badger Radio, and the coordinator of the non-feminist Women's Liberation Network. If you missed the first part of our chat, don't forget to check it out. And in this episode, we discuss the different types of approaches taken by people broadly associated with the men's rights movement, male hierarchies, free speech, who should or does dictate the Overton window, and why some people in society seem to view incels with so much contempt. But first, one of the biggest criticisms levelled at men's rights activists is that they are so defined by feminism that they spend more time slagging off feminists than they do doing anything actually practical to actually help men. It's a paradox I've struggled with while working on the Problems with Men series, because it's impossible to address the issue of male inequalities without acknowledging the state infrastructure, perceptions, prejudices and dominant political opinions relevant to this issue. And so I asked Natty if she believed that criticism of feminist ideology is inevitable, given the monopoly position it currently holds when it comes to gender equality narratives.
Yeah, exactly. And I do think there are numerous men's charities and organizations out there that avoid talking about feminism exactly.
Yes.
And they're doing really good work. Some of them are doing, they exist and they're doing what they need to do.
Yeah.
But if you talk to them privately, not naming any names,
Yeah.
they understand what we're talking about. They just don't want to talk about it publicly.
Yeah.
They don't want to be excluded from the conversation and from the ability to be actively involved.
Yeah.
So, it leaves it to people like us to call out and to try and get the public to understand.
Yeah. One of the things that really disappointed me about the Hope Not Hates report was that prominent supporters of men's rights, I was surprised that nobody spoke out against, or spoken, surprised that men's rights was being sort of associated with, far right extremism. And I think kind of one of the reasons for that is exactly as you say. You have this kind of separation in terms of speaking openly and taking the hits, so to speak, which is harder if you are, for example, trying to stay within the mainstream media bubble, or if you're trying to secure funding for your charity and actually do some difference on the ground. So I suppose my question is, in terms of cooperation between the different sectors of men's rights, if that makes sense, are there many splits? Are there many genuine splits, or is it more kind of like some people are less reluctant to speak openly about what they really believe?
I don't know how much I'm... Will I get? I don't know if anyone's going to get annoyed at me. I think that most people who are involved in doing real active things to help men are very much aware of the barriers that feminists put up. And I would be surprised if there was anyone that disagreed with that. I think that most of them that are fairly successful in this very small area just are basically toddling along and doing what they're doing. And I don't want to dismiss what the good work they're doing by saying they're toddling along. What I'm saying is they still exist because they don't actively shout. against certain feminist influences. You know, and in a way, this is a good thing because it means that there is definitely a need for organizations to help men that have nothing to do with feminism or women whatsoever, really.
Yeah.
Now, but at the same time, I think it is becoming increasingly difficult for them to grow from where they are. Yeah.
Yeah. It's another one of those paradoxes, I think, because you have there's some people, without naming names, that have kind of in some ways very much helped to kind of legitimize and promote the issues that everybody agrees on. I think even, if you look at kind of International Men's Day and the difference between even 5 years ago, how that was perceived, it was that thing, it was ignored and then it was laughed at. And kind of now there's this attempt to kind of appropriate it, or kind of make sure that, well, if you're talking about men's rights, you're talking about them in such a certain way that isn't anti-feminist, for example.
Yeah.
It's pro-feminist. And the paradox is that at some point, whether or not you take the more sort of, I would say, more difficult path, or less popular path, or less profitable path even, and just speak your mind. I think that was the thing about the non-feminists manifesto, which Hope Not Hate really had a problem with. Let me just find it.
Yes, they do.
Yes, non-feminist declaration, recognizing the growth of feminist aggression. We assert our right to exist and thrive without paying any respect to feminists or their ideology. We shall not permit feminists to dictate what we say, how we say it, or how we interact with the world. Now, again, if you're someone who's never really thought very much about it, perhaps that sounds extremist, because some people will interpret that as, basically, we're not going to pay any respect for women, which clearly is not the case. It's a political ideology.
Mm-hmm.
Now, would it be unfair to say that there's a growth of feminist aggression as a power base? Would it be unfair?
I don't think that's unfair. I think that's accurate.
It's certainly, certainly from the perspective that, kind of feminism has, as a political ideology, does seem to kind of punch above its weight in terms of representation, in terms of coverage in the media, etc. It feels like sometimes people are trying to dictate what I can or can't say, or how I can say it, or interact with the world.
Yeah, well, what they're doing is they're giving you a very limited sphere or spectrum to be able to think within.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have to say this goes wider than just the government and certain lobby groups and organizations that promote feminist interests.
Yes.
For example, the Battle of Ideas Festival happens every year in the Barbican, and that's organized by the Academy of Ideas, Institute of Ideas, and what I think the main director is Claire Fox.
Yes. Yep.
Now, she has championed democracy, and she has written for Spiked magazine, and they're very much has a relationship with them. And also, she has spoken out against feminism and has been critical of feminism with the Me Too stuff recently. And so that's all in good faith, and I respect her for all of that. However, at the Battle of Ideas, she would be, I know that there's a bias with her and her organisers of that event against what she calls MRAs.
Yes.
People like Mike Buchanan, and Justice for Men and Boys, and people associated with him.
Yeah.
they have they kind of recoil at
Yes.
the fact that those guys exist, or would like representation at a debate festival such as this event.
Yeah.
I'm not saying he's gone and begged them to be part of their lineup and stuff, but what I mean is, from what I've seen,
Yeah.
we have some shared interests with these people, and when I say we, I mean me and Mike and Elizabeth.
Yeah.
And but they're very reluctant to engage with MRAs in good faith.
Yes.
They will discuss, they will criticize aspects of feminism, and they have had a few talks about men's issues in the past.
Yeah.
But there are certain people they won't have Mike on their panel, probably, unless they want to portray him negatively. And this is unfortunate, because this is one of the best events out there. This is what we have. We don't have many pro free speech events, and even this event doesn't treat certain people in the same way, and that's disappointing, because I do like these guys. They don't, they won't have a proper discussion about circumcision, for example. I mean, I know that subject has been broached in the past, but compared to other issues, they won't lay all openly out. In a way, it's treated very much delicately.
It's a hot potato.
It's a hot potato, yeah. And I don't think they want to dictate the Overton window, which you obviously know what that is, right?
Yeah.
Don't really. I think they tend to respond to where the Overton window has been pushed to, rather than try and dictate it. And that's unfortunate, because I think that they are in a position where they should be dictating it, but they're not. And so what I'm going to say is that people like Mike Buchanan and Paul Elam and such, they have pushed the Overton window quite a lot in recent times, and everyone else has responded to that.
Yes, I don't think that's unfair. I think that's the thing, that some people choose a path which is potentially, maybe in some ways, actually gets more things done and is more acceptable within that Overton window, but they're less likely to push the window. They'll follow it. They will move into that space because they probably do agree with, kind of, as we say, kind of most of the issues. Yeah, no, that's interesting. In terms of perception, like what you're saying about the likes of the battle for ideas, one aspect may be kind of a fear of association, or that it brings controversy, or whatever that aspect. But the impression I get from a lot of kind of columnists and thinkers that I would have a lot of respect for, and who seem to be very much aligned in their perspective of the world in so many ways. And I'm thinking the likes of Spike, Brendan O'Neill, and Joanna Williams, yes. Yeah. And I think there are a few other examples where I've been very surprised to find them speaking so badly of MRAs.
When they agree with the majority of what MRAs have to say, but they don't want to admit that.
And but it strikes me as it's not necessarily. It doesn't strike me as, I could be wrong here, but it doesn't strike me as that they're being intellectually dishonest. That they actually do seem to genuinely have a perception that men rights activists, they're pathetic, or they're going about it the wrong way, or
right. So here's, sorry to interrupt you. This is where it comes from, because these people in a way are they're the most understanding of the cause. They are very understanding, because they've written books and lots of essays and articles and things, but as we discussed, they don't like to push the Overton window that on their own. They like to respond, but it comes from something that's much deeper than this, though. So there's this whole thing with the thought of men as victims, and the thought of men as being kind of all powerful, full of agency, and in control of their lives.
Okay.
And as soon as we start to suggest that men don't have that control, right? Everyone starts to get a bit uncomfortable, and they start saying, "Oh no, it's the man's fault if that's not happening in their life. Something's not doing well for them. It's because he didn't do this, and he didn't respond, and he didn't, and so it's this idea of hyper agency that we all seem to align on generally as in our psyche, I'd say, as a society.
Yeah.
That everything is basically, men are either in control of everything, and if something goes wrong in their lives, it's because they made a mistake, or they haven't done something right, they haven't responded correctly to something. And we basically have put the whole agency on men alone, and we do not admit or acknowledge that men are also responding to the agency or lack of agency that women have, right? And also it's to do with the hierarchies that everyone puts men into. So feminists talk about the patriarchy, and the patriarchy, to me, what they're really saying is, well, they expand it to the whole of men, but they're talking about the men on top. When you have this pyramid, and you've got the men, the billionaires, the guys who pull strings in the background, who fund everything, the alphas, right? And they're always seen as men alone, and that's the patriarchy.
Not necessarily unfairly.
No, not necessarily. But the point is that then you've got men, the rest of men below that, right? And it's this idea that if you're a man and you're in the lower rungs of the hierarchy, right, it's completely your fault. And because we have the patriarchy, and therefore you haven't been man enough, and you haven't worked hard enough to get into a certain position. And so it's related to how we view male hierarchy, in my opinion, because MRAs are viewed as kind of failures, men who failed because you haven't been able to self-actualize and become a man, an adult or whatever. And because you admit that you can be a victim sometimes, then you are basically just not worth bothering with. Yeah.
And
the only people that are allowed to admit themselves as victims are women and children. And even children, I'd say that's another conversation for another time, but I actually think sometimes we're much more favourable to women than we are to children. But hey.
Yes. Yeah, I would fundamentally agree with that. In terms of kind of policy making and priorities, sometimes.
But this also brings me to thinking about the other groups in the manosphere, as they call it. So you've also got as you mentioned before, the MGTOWs and the PUAs and the red pill guys, traditionalist guys, and or tradcons, as we like to call them. They also very much buy into this idea that men have full agency, and that men are basically impenetrable by other influences in society, and therefore everything that they do is a response of a man's internal thinking and his nature, right? And that all the influences he has are just, he's like Teflon, or he should be like Teflon.
Okay. Right? Yeah.
And so his manliness is tested by that, and if he fails, it's because he's not man enough, right?
Yeah.
And and feminists have bought into this idea as well by saying, patriarchy hurts men too.
Yes.
But that idea is only talking about other men affecting other men, right?
Yes. Yes.
Which happens. That that's a nuanced thing, a part of that I agree with.
Yeah.
But they will completely ignore any influence that women have on men.
Yeah.
Or they will say, if a man is influenced by a woman, he is not man enough.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. Let me read you a quote. And this is from. I was just kind of looking to see kind of what was been said about you online, and this is from. I presume you've seen this Incels wiki.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, and obviously there's a perception being pushed about the concept of incels, and suddenly that they're kind of actively involved in terrorism, as a they're kind of linked to incidents or whatever. But okay, so my understanding of an incel is essentially somebody who has given up trying to date. Is that the core of it? Is that fair? Is that
that's an overlap with MGTOW there, I guess.
okay?
I would say the definition of an incel is someone who has tried to date, but
Yes.
women are not interested in dating them.
Yes, sorry. That's a crucial distinction. Well, so it says here, not only are you a well-known UK anti-feminist in the manosphere, but you're also a not so well-known incel sympathizer. Okay, which strikes me. Let's see. You have one of the most sympathetic attitudes towards incels as a female anywhere on the internet.
That's a bit of an exaggeration, probably, but
It's
yeah.
it's less about even how accurate that is, but even as a statement, that strikes me as kind of okay, because clearly they're criticizing you for being sympathetic with these group of men that are fit within that definition of being right down at the bottom of the pyramids. Which strikes me as quite a charitable perspective for you to have with all your female agency and etc. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
I saw that, and because it said I was a manosphere figure, and I was like, don't tell the manosphere, because anyway, no, I'm just because I'm talking about like the red pill guys. They'll reject that. They'll reject MRA, and they'll also reject me as a woman, which is the other interesting thing. But they that particular thing is referring to the fact that I did an interview with this guy called William, who is a publicly known incel. So when the term incel burst onto the scene with the unfortunate mass murder by Alec Manassian, and I think it'd been brewing a little bit before then as well, like the people started using the term more often. I joined a Facebook group called Incelistan.
Okay.
And I was kind of aware of these guys beforehand, but I didn't really know many who outwardly identified as incel. But I've kind of, because I was an admin in Women Gets Feminism group for a while, I've come across all kinds of different guys online, right? Okay. And so I did an interview with him, and he was just saying to me how, a lot of the media, there has been some balanced articles about incels that he is engaged in and been interviewed for, but generally they're hostile to him. And he was saying that most of the women that he's spoken to are either hostile, or they reject this term incel, where they will say, but if you just did this or you just did that, then you won't be an incel, and you just be yourself and develop yourself, and women will love you. And, they just try and help them in a naive, sometimes condescending, and sometimes outwardly just kind of like, not derogatory, but, when you're you're kind of like, oh, just get on with it and
Yeah.
stop moaning. That kind of attitude.
It strikes me there's a relationship with the likes of kind of mental illness or depression or whatever. And I'm thinking of kind of Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Your Life, and absolutely kind of one of the that advice about clean your room, for example. Yeah, sure. There's sort of there sometimes advice that says kind of get your act together, don't feel sorry for yourself, pull your boots up. That that has relevance, but that doesn't necessarily help someone in the place they're at that time.
No.
If a man is physically unattractive to the vast majority of women, for example, for whatever reason, whether that's physical features or kind of lack of money or kind of status or whatever, kind of certainly there are certain things that can help them to dig them out of that situation, but it still strikes me as kind of like quite a strange thing just to not have some sort of empathy for people in that situation.
Yeah, and a lot of the that's, I'd say that's quite a good way of putting it, because a lot of the people I will talk to online about incels, and it's mostly young men who say this to me as well, because young men, I'm not saying it's only young men, but in reference to what I'm talking about, they don't want to think of themselves as an incel, right, or as potentially being one. That is detrimental to their identity. Because they are defined by their relationship to women, right? When women are now saying we're not defined by our relationship to men, even though we kind of are. It's like it's a weird paradox again, where I basically am trying to explain to people that men and women are defined by the relationship to each other, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? In the sense that defined in the sense that we are defined by our relationships with other people, and generally that's the opposite sex. But it doesn't mean that you have to build your identity on what the opposite sex thinks of you. You should just build your identity to self-actualize as a decent human being, perhaps. But you can't really escape it. We're kind of all in it together, right? And so we should just be able to admit where we are in this particular definition, in this. And I know it's crude. I do use it though in this idea of a marketplace, because we kind of all are in the marketplace together, right? Yeah. And it is kind of crude to put it that way, but it is useful to describe it like that.
But that's why they call discos meat markets.
Well, yeah. Yeah. And basically incels are just admitting that. They're saying we are failing in this marketplace. We're failures. And we don't really feel like doing anything about it right now, or we think that it's not worth doing anything about it, or we think that we're not going to be able to do anything about it. And just everyone out there is just like, how could you believe that about yourself? And that doesn't sound very nice. No one wants to have such low self-esteem and be that insecure where they think that no one else is going to want to be with them. But like, what if that is what's actually happening? I mean, I just think that we should be able to admit when that happens and not deny. I think just people they're in a bit of a delusion about it. So, for example, I have done an interview with an incel recently, which I'm going to publish soon. Okay, and he's happy to call himself an incel. Okay. And he says that basically he's got mental health and he's got health conditions. Okay. Right. And so he says he can't have a relationship with a woman because that's related to those issues, right? Yeah. And I think that when people use the term incel, they think of some young guy or some guy who's just his personality is so abhorrent to people, or his issues are so bad and he has never tried to solve them,
Yes. Yeah.
basically he deserves his position.
Yes.
That everything is in his control. And
Yes.
what I'm trying to do with this interview and what I'm trying to do with this conversation about incels is say, well, there's a lot of stuff that isn't in their control.
Yeah.
And also there's a lot of stuff that used to be in their control in the past in society that we've taken away from them. So when you're saying to them, just go out there and pull your socks up, so you know, just work hard.
Yeah.
You're pushing them to you're pushing them to do something, and they're going to fail probably, right? And people will say, "Oh, that's not fair. That's not very nice. You're not being very supportive." I'm like, no, putting someone out there when I know they're going to fail, to me, that's abuse. Like, I just don't think that we should be doing that. We should be preparing them and saying, okay, what compassion can we have for this person? What can we do to help them? What can we do out in society, in the environment, to make sure that when they do try, that they have a chance of actually succeeding?
Yeah. No, I mean, this is the thing. It kind of this is probably a good example of an area where this just strikes me as absolute common sense, and yet I'm kind of thinking, gosh, you know, somebody might quote me talking to you about incels sometime, and sort of, you know, kind of, you know, draw a link to some mass shooting somewhere, you know, kind of that sort of they're being demonized as a group. And the same way, you know, kind of like you can demonize people with mental illness. People with mental illness have been involved in many crimes, but you know, kind of the society tends to have kind of become more understanding of a lot of issues, of a lot, you know, of a lot of groups. And there is this absolute disdain for this concept of incels, and you know, that was just a bit that kind of strikes me as amazing, that you would be criticized for trying to understand them and possibly help them.
Well, they have extreme self-hate, as generally when you talk to them, and in fact most of them tend to believe the feminist myths and narratives too. I wouldn't say that as a group that they generally are red-pilled. I mean, I think a lot of them are, because they're in a similar space online, but they want to reject it, right? So, you know, I would say that a lot of the MGTOWs, some of them were probably incels.
Yes,
at
there's
some
definitely
point.
a crossover.
Yeah, there's a crossover, but that doesn't mean that all MGTOWs are incels. I know plenty of real life MGTOWs, and they're not incels, right? And there's also this mistaken belief that all incels want is to get laid. But actually, for example, the one that I spoke to recently, he has a sex worker. Okay. He accepts the fact that, like, that's probably the best way for him to get sex. But you know,
very different to companionship.
Exactly. It's not a relationship with a woman who actively, voluntarily accepted them as a person as they are, right? And what I said in the interview as well is that there isn't really such a thing as a female incel. And this is the other thing that I bless the guys that I've had these discussions with about. They will say that feminists are kind of, the radical feminists especially, are female incels, femcells as they call them. Now, I'm not saying they don't exist, because I'm sure, like, Andrea Dawkins probably was a femcell. You know, maybe, but they are rare compared to a male incel, in my opinion. Because when I was discussing this with people with disabilities and health issues who are more likely to be incel, and I was saying, you know, do you know have any female friends, or anyone who goes to your community center where you see disabled people, etc. And like, we just more or less agreed that even women with similar issues to the men are able to get some kind of boyfriend.
Well, I mean, I suppose one of the things that sort of would point to that is the data that's been discussed about the likes of dating sites and the kind of the raw data of what is it that sort of there's a massive difference in terms of what men will accept as a potential match for a date.
Yeah.
And that sort of 80% of women were chasing 20% of the men, or maybe even less than that. So yeah, well, even that sense in terms of kind of what people are prepared to kind of look at even as a possibility for a date, let alone a relationship kind of thing. That's certainly going to, these things, they're it's fascinating. One of the reasons I did I've kind of started doing the problems for men videos, it's kind of partly to educate myself as well, about things like incels. The barriers to addressing what are pretty obvious and generally accepted kind of issues that men face, particularly the most mainstream ones like education, mental health and suicide, etc. But the barriers are so complex. There's so many of them. There's so many layers to them that it is very, very hard to unpick them in a way that is I suppose, a productive way of doing it, but also because of the feminist ideology aspect of those barriers, it's very hard to talk about some of them without it automatically being seen as, there's so many chill factors, I suppose would be the term, to actually just talking about, well, how do you help somebody who sees himself as an incel at that place and may absolutely be, kind of very angry at women, like, for example, for rejecting them. But how do you talk about that if you're, kind of seen, criticized for empathizing, or, what was it that they said, sympathetic towards incels? That strikes me as insane.
Yeah, I know. It's like they're kind of like, oh, she's sympathetic towards us. What's wrong with her? Why is she doing that?
Well, I'm pretty sure there's nothing wrong with Natty. And if you can make it to central London on the 17th of November, you can hear plenty more from her when she hosts a spectacular range of speakers in the 3rd annual conference, Messages for Men. Speakers include Carl Benjamin, Zuby, the brilliant William Collins, and Richard, who recently sat down and talked to Natty about his experience as an incel in a brilliant 2-part video that you should definitely check out. I'll leave the links below, along with links for the Messages for Men conference, and look out for plenty more Talking Sense Not Sensibility, which should be heading your way very soon.
Can't you see it too? There's an elephant in the room.
The Glass Blind Spot is brought to you by you, because it's your views, your likes and your comments that keep this show on the road.